20 years after the birth of Israel, a new Arab leader is keen to take on the fight. Yasser Arafat becomes chairman of the Palestine Liberation Organization. Its declared aim to liberate Palestine by force. From bases in neighboring Arab states, the Palestinians plan a campaign of terror against Israel. They don't have fighter planes or tanks, but they have landmines and guns.
The most important thing, more important possibly than actually liberating physically bits of territory from Israeli occupation, was to shock the world into seeing the Palestinians, into recognizing that they existed, into recognizing that an injustice had happened to them.
Radicals within the PLO resort to publicity-grabbing international terrorism. In 1970, they hijack 3 planes, divert them to Jordan, and blow them up. And this was just the start. 2 years after the plane hijacks, terror comes to the Olympic Games in Munich. As the world watches, Palestinian terrorists kill 11 Israeli athletes. But this act by a PLO splinter group undermines Arafat's leadership. To regain control, he realizes that diplomacy may be the answer. Arafat is persuaded that war alone won't achieve his ends and turns to diplomacy. The Arab nations have just recognized the PLO as the sole representative voice of the Palestinian people. Now, Arafat wants legitimacy from more significant countries and addresses the UN in a major diplomatic move.
I am raising the olive branch in one hand and the gun to protect this olive branch.
President Jimmy Carter puts the Middle East top of his foreign agenda and invites Egypt and Israel to talks at Camp David. A year later, President Sadat of Egypt and Prime Minister Begin of Israel sign a treaty in which Israel agrees to withdraw from the Sinai. It's the first peace agreement between the Israelis and an Arab state. Israel agrees to return the whole of the Sinai to Egypt and to dismantle the settlements it's built there. 2 years after securing peace with Israel, Sadat is assassinated by Muslim extremists. His quest for peace leads to his death. And there's to be no deal for the Palestinian refugees. Arafat's diplomatic moves are slow. The PLO now has a powerful base in Lebanon. They mount numerous assaults against Israel, shelling towns across the border, killing many civilians. Determined to deal with the PLO once and for all, Israel invades Lebanon, even entering the capital, Beirut. Acting as peace brokers, the U.S. negotiates a safe passage out of Beirut for the PLO fighters to exile in Tunis. Although there's a civil war in Lebanon, the U.S. promises the PLO that women and children left behind in the refugee camps of Sabra and Shatila will be safe. Those names are engraved in the memory of the Palestinian people. The Israeli army led a Christian militia into the camps where the Palestinians are living.
Just about 2 weeks after the final evacuation of PLO forces from Beirut, the Christian militias that had been brought in by the Israeli army into the refugee camps in Beirut conducted an appalling massacre of anything from 800 to possibly 2,000 people. Every living thing in the camps was eliminated basically by the right-wing Christian militias that had been allied with Israel since 1976 and armed by Israel and trained by Israel.
There's a huge outcry around the world, and 500,000 Israelis also protest. For the Palestinians, it's a tragedy, but exiled in Tunis, Arafat is powerless to help. Since the Six-Day War of 1967, 1.7 million Palestinians on the West Bank and in Gaza live under Israeli military control. After 1967, Israel builds Jewish settlements in the West Bank and Gaza, breaching international law, which states that an occupying army can't alter land it controls. Still not recognized as a separate entity, the Palestinians have no vote and no real political voice, nor the means to complain about the settlements and settlers, or about their suppression. Tension builds up. Then 4 Palestinians are killed when their car collides with an Israeli patrol vehicle. Enraged by decades of military rule, the people of Gaza take to the streets. What starts as stone throwing escalates into a full-scale uprising, the Intifada, which means shaking off in Arabic.
It is the resistance and the revolution of all our children, or our women, or our people, or our men. This is the accumulation of the revolution.
Israel responds to the stone throwing and rebellion with the full force of a modern army pitted against unarmed civilians. Once more, the Middle East is at the center of world attention. The Intifada gives Yasser Arafat a new negotiating tool, and he intends to use it. But few anticipate his diplomatic preemptive strike. From Algeria in 1988, Yasser Arafat makes a surprise announcement. He declares the state of Palestine, and in an historic move, accepts the UN Resolution 242, Land for Peace. If Israel withdrew, the Arab countries would recognize the Jewish state. The way is now open for talks, and Arafat is invited back to the UN in December 1988. But the U.S. insists he renounce terrorism.
He worked gradually, at times implicitly, to swing opinion within the PLO to accepting the principle of negotiation with Israel and of a compromise solution with Israel. Now, this was very difficult because he had a very strong left wing who were much more militant, who demanded attachment to total liberation of Palestine.
But Arafat's opponents aren't just within the PLO. He's always been challenged by more radical factions. A new militant group called Hamas is to become serious opposition. Hamas are part of a religious movement which sees Islam as the solution to all political problems. The politics of the Middle East changed drastically when Iraq's Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait in 1990. Arab countries previously hostile to the West join Western coalition forces to defeat Iraq. Arafat's disastrous decision to support Iraq leaves him bereft of allies. He's sidelined, and the PLO are left in the cold, just as America launched a peace initiative. In 1991, America plays host to Arab nations and Israel to negotiate a peace deal in Madrid. But it takes James Baker a year to get the parties around the table. Israel refuses to negotiate with the PLO, so delegates from Gaza and the West Bank represent the Palestinians.
I think a lot of things were accomplished by Madrid. You ended up with a process between Israelis and Palestinians that for a period of time was productive. The only way you're going to solve the problem is through political dialogue.
But unknown to the Americans, and away from the scrutiny of the world, there are secret talks in Oslo between the Israelis and the PLO. With the election of Yitzhak Rabin in Israel, peace becomes a priority, and he encourages the meetings. And in Norway, the PLO and Israeli negotiators bond. The chief U.S. negotiator realizes the significance of the moment.
I said to the Secretary, this is historic. Here are two national movements that have rejected each other's existence, and now they're accepting each other's existence.
Back in Washington, a declaration of principles is signed. It lays the groundwork for the beginning of Palestinian self-rule and Israeli withdrawal from the territories it's occupied. Israel agrees to withdraw from areas of the West Bank and Gaza and to gradually give control to the newly created Palestinian Authority. First, they withdraw from Gaza and Jericho, and then from 7 major towns in the West Bank. The rest of the West Bank is divided into separate zones under varying degrees of Israeli control. The sensitive issues of Jerusalem, borders, settlers, and the refugees are left for later discussions. Just 2 years after the peace process starts, it's stopped in its tracks.
If you ask me what was the one violent incident that more than any other derailed Oslo, I would tell you it was a single bullet. It was the bullet that was fired in November 1995 that killed the Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, because that bullet, fired by a Jewish extremist, an Israeli right-winger, destroyed the man who more than any other gave Israelis confidence in the peace process.
Like Anwar Sadat before him, Yitzhak Rabin's quest for peace cost him his life. For several months, his successor, Shimon Peres, struggles to fulfill Rabin's legacy and keep the spirit of the Oslo Accords alive. Rabin's partner in peace, Yasser Arafat, returns from exile to Gaza. He is elected as president of the new Palestinian Authority in 1996 and, following the Oslo Accords, begins to build up the infrastructure of a state. Israeli troop withdrawal begins, but Israel still retains overall control of the occupied territories. The Palestinians hope that within 5 years, they'll become fully independent. But the extremists are not going to let the peace process continue. The campaign to destabilize the country gathers pace. Israel suffers a wave of bombings against civilians. The Israelis have had enough, and within a few months, they elect right-winger Benjamin Netanyahu, who promises peace with security. Netanyahu opposes the Oslo Accords and slows down their implementation. Dismayed that the peace process has slowed under Netanyahu, the Israelis vote in Ehud Barak in 1999. In the final days of his presidency, Bill Clinton is looking for a grand finale. He hopes to bring peace to the Middle East and invites the Israelis and Palestinians to Camp David II in July 2000. Prime Minister Barak believes he's offering an unprecedented settlement. The deal includes withdrawal from more than 90% of the Israeli-occupied territories, but the Palestinians want further discussion. The peace talks fail once again, heightening tension in the region. Right-wing politician Ariel Sharon chooses this moment to visit the Muslims' holiest place in Jerusalem. With the permission of the Prime Minister, he arrives with an armed guard and enters the Muslim sanctuary known as Haram al-Sharif, or Temple Mount to the Jews. Violence erupts, leading to a second intifada. A month later, Palestinians lynch 2 Israeli army reservists. And for Israel, these deaths symbolize the barbarity of Palestinian mob violence. Tensions escalate. Palestinian suicide bombings against Israel intensify, and Prime Minister Barak loses faith. The Israeli public want a hardliner to crack down on the Palestinians. They elect Likud leader Ariel Sharon in the hope that this is the man who can bring security and stop the suicide bombings. To stop the terror, Sharon launches Operation Defensive Shield in March 2002, invading towns under Palestinian rule. Yasser Arafat is held hostage in his headquarters and shelled. Now the peace process is in the hands of Ariel Sharon and Yasser Arafat. longtime adversaries who symbolize the struggle for the land which lies at the roots of conflict.